Welcome to science class. Today we are going to talk about agriculture. You might be thinking, Mr. Peterson, this is earth science class and agriculture is just technology. That's not nature. And while that is correct, it's not 100% correct. You see, agriculture is the manipulation of nature. And while GMO and hybrid crops and animals exist, we didn't create them from scratch in the lab. In the last unit, we covered human impact, and agriculture seems to me to be the one human activity that has the greatest impact on the planet. Food is also what has allowed the world's population to explode from 1.65 billion 100 years ago to over 7.5 billion today. That's a massive change. So how did it happen? That will be the first thing we cover today, what agriculture is and what the agricultural revolution was. I actually maintain, and so do many experts whose ideas I have read, that there have actually been 3 agricultural revolutions. The first one occurring all around the world thousands of years ago, and the second and third revolutions both occurring in the 20th century. I also feel that a 4th agricultural revolution is coming in the near future, either out of necessity or concern for the future. Let's get started. So what is agriculture anyways? It's defined as the science or practice of cultivation of the soil for the growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, fibers, and other products. Basically, to do agriculture, you keep some of the seeds you harvest, plant them systematically, keep track of your animals if you're raising them, breed them systematically, and feed them with the food you grow. This system has been carried out by Sumerians and Facebookers and Minecraft players the world over. Side note, apparently we are supposed to call Minecraft computer Legos from now on. It's a very good system for the most part. The alternative to agriculture is hunter-gathering, which you've probably heard of. Ironically, settling down and inventing agriculture for a really long time was, well, one of the worst ideas we ever had. Were we really better off to give up foraging food for sitting down and growing it? In a lot of ways, no. Our diets became worse, a lot worse. And by extension, our health and physique suffered as well. When pilgrims first came to the Americas, they were in awe of the indigenous people they came across. They were like giants. They were muscular, fit, and tall, and were thriving, at least until smallpox would inevitably catch up. The Europeans, by contrast, came from places in the world stricken by diseases like rickets, and where people ate an extremely limited diet. The indigenous Americans were hunter-horticulturalists, which pretty much means that they grew the crops they needed, but hunted for animal protein, and they didn't waste the food they grew by feeding it to animals. Hunter-gatherers also had way more free time than people who settled down to farm. The animals we have raised surely aren't doing any better. You can measure success in numbers, and yes, there are vastly more farm animals alive today than there were thousands of years ago. But they live some of the most miserable lives of any creatures on the planet. Dairy cows spend almost their entire lives pregnant because their bodies don't produce milk otherwise. Many calves that are born are kept in pens too small for them to move or even to stand up in, so that their muscles become flaccid so they can be turned into veal. Chickens are crammed into wire cages with 2 or 3 other hens to do nothing but eat, poop, and lay eggs. Not to mention they're stupid. Domesticated animals have significantly smaller brains because we have bred them not to even be capable of surviving on their own, but in fact quite the opposite. It has been estimated that 10,000 years ago, humans and their domesticates represented less than 0.1% of the vertebrate land biomass. Today we represent around 98% of it. That's an unbelievable flip-flop. And sure, in some ways you could call that progress or success. But I think there are lots of ways you can call it the opposite of that as well. Technology has a way of actually setting us backwards. Many people believe justifiably that the internet and especially social media has actually become a plague on our society and culture. Now, does that mean we are doomed? No. I think my track record is pretty clear. I don't think we are going to collapse. But things often get worse before they get better. We actually didn't see the benefits of agriculture for thousands of years, arguably. We just barely got back to a better state of living and health in the 20th century compared to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. But now, thanks to our terrible diets, we might be undoing that yet again. Obviously, there were benefits because agriculture won. Writing, government, disease resistance, city-states, these things all came from cultures that settled down in large groups to grow food. Eventually, science was possible from this. The only reason people can sit down and be scientists is people and governments have enough food and money to pay people to do things other than grow food. Like I just explained, this was a radical shift from the way we had been living on Earth for a couple 100,000 years. So why did it take so long to invent? I mean, think about it. 100 years ago, airplanes were death traps. Wireless communication didn't exist. The dictionary didn't contain the word plastic. The world has changed so much in those 100 years. What if the agricultural revolution had happened 500 years earlier? What world would we be living in? Flying cars, moon resorts, every book ever written downloaded straight into your brain from birth? If only those jerks had gotten off their butts and started planting seeds a little bit earlier. Well, here's the thing. Agriculture was as much an accident as a discovery. The vast majority of plants and animals are worthless for domestication. This is what native corn looks like. Now, compare that to its modern-day cereal crop variant. Yeah, you're not going to feed a civilization based off of the original. It is the same story with almost all crops and fruit. They are either tiny or full of seeds or contain bitterants and toxins or only grow in tiny climate regions, you name it. You see, us humans have a very species-centric way of looking at, well, everything. But here's a piece of information that should not be mind-blowing, but probably is. Plants don't want to be eaten. Well, actually, the reason fruits exist is to be eaten, but you need the seeds to go with that, but to us, those are a waste. The point is, we only ever got lucky with crops by finding random mutant varieties of them. Berries that are plump usually have a condition called polyploidy, where they have too many chromosomes. It just happens that the chromosomes that control the growth rate of flesh are the ones that have extra copies. Animals are even worse. Here's a collage of common domesticated farm animals. Almost every one of these animals comes from Eurasia. The New World had no cows, sheep, goats, horses, or pigs. The New World did have some of the best crops, however. Tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chilies, beans. These evolved in Central and South America. Imagine that. Italian cuisine before Columbus did not include the tomato. But the point is, the vast majority of animals don't want to be domesticated. Zebras in Africa were never domesticated. Neither were any of the other medium-sized mammals. They're just too dangerous. Bison, deer, and antelope in North America were never domesticated either. I should clarify here that agriculture didn't appear just once and spread throughout the world. There are over half a dozen places around the world where people independently utilized agricultural techniques with the kind of food they had available to them. The other limiting factor in agriculture was the climate. People all around the world developed ways to irrigate, but most people were at the mercy of the climate. Crops are also much more finicky than animals and don't like to migrate to new climates. Another reason agriculture was much more limited in the Americas was that the Americas stretch north-south, with an extremely narrow bottleneck in the center. People, plants, and ideas don't travel well into new climates, especially when funneled through such a narrow pathway. Compare the east to west pathways where people, plants, and ideas traveled between Europe and Asia along the Silk Route. Much easier to do. Agriculture continued in its virgin state all the way up through the Industrial Revolution. If we were going to fundamentally change agriculture, we would have to start getting scientific, and that's eventually what happened. The second agricultural revolution can actually be pinpointed to an exact date. The domestication of crops and animals happened independently on dates that range over many thousands of years. But the next revolution occurred exactly on July 2nd, 1909, at the University of Karlsruhe in Karlsruhe, Germany. It was here that two chemists, Fritz Haber and Robert Le Rossignol, invented the Haber-Bosch process, which created the first synthetic fertilizer. Last week we talked about how plants get their nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is the one always in short supply, and Haber and Le Rossignol's process created liquid ammonia out of the air. It was an absolute miracle of an invention, and make no mistake, these two men are almost directly responsible for the existence of 6 billion people, because that's how much the world population has increased since then. We now grow 250% more food today than we did back then, but we only have expanded cropland by 12%. Today's population numbers would never have happened without these two scientists. Haber's story is actually mired in controversy. See, he won the Nobel Prize for his discovery, and justifiably so. But several world-leading scientists boycotted the Nobel Prize ceremony, which honored him, also justifiably so. Haber invented mustard gas, and he unapologetically and ruthlessly pursued the advancement of chemical warfare in serving his native Germany in World War I. Haber eventually came to detest Adolf Hitler and had no part in World War II, but an insecticide he invented called Zyklon was altered slightly by Nazi chemists and turned into Zyklon B, which was used in gas chambers to murder countless numbers of people. Before synthetic fertilizers, countries relied on guano islands for shipments of bird feces to be shipped across oceans to spread on crops. This newspaper clipping from an 1800s newspaper writes how horses and soldiers were gathered off the battlefields during the Napoleonic Wars so that their bones could be separated and turned into fertilizer. People literally relied on other people to die in glorious campaigns to provide fertilizer for the country by means of their bones. Now you can buy bottles of fertilizer thousands of times more concentrated for about 20 minutes worth of wages at the store. It's also killing the oceans, or at least parts of them. The fertilizer we use ends up as runoff in river systems, which dump their contents into the oceans, creating these dead zones we mentioned a few videos back. So that was what many people and myself consider the second agricultural revolution. The third agricultural revolution has been called the Green Revolution. This occurred between the 1950s and 60s, and its main leader was Norman Borlaug, an American agronomist from Iowa. Norman's work was especially influential in impoverished regions around the world, and he is credited with saving close to 1 billion lives. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. The Green Revolution sounds like it's all about natural farming, but it was the exact opposite. The key strategies in Borlaug's methodology included developing high-yield varieties of cereals, expanding irrigation infrastructure, hybridizing seeds, and the use of synthetic fertilizers. We've talked about this, but Earth wasn't made for people, although millions of Americans think it was, literally created for literally that reason. We've just barely began to eke out a comfortable living, and technology is what makes that possible. The current state of agriculture is obviously pretty good. Malnourishment and the cost of food are at all-time lows, and that trend will only continue. Still, there are concerns. We've covered most of these, so I'll be brief. Fertilizers are a major concern because they cause massive algae blooms which lead to anoxia, or dead zones created by water losing its dissolved oxygen. The algae doesn't remove the oxygen. Instead, the rapidly multiplying bacteria that consume the decaying algae does. Surface water and groundwater in many places around the world is used at a greater rate than it can be replenished. Using groundwater for irrigation also deposits salts onto the soil, sterilizing it. Paradoxically, increasing the height of the water table below ground can have the same effect. Deep-rooted plants like trees, if they are removed, allow the groundwater to sit closer to the surface, and it brings salt with it many times. Agriculture is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. These effects are magnified by deforestation, which is caused primarily by, or at least for, agriculture. Here's a weird statistic. We consume almost none of the food we grow. 70% of the crops that are grown are fed to cattle. Only around 1% of all crops grown in fields end up on store shelves. We have it so good that we can grow food and feed it to animals, and food and meat still doesn't cost very much. Indeed, the cow is probably the most wasteful and inefficient means of producing calories. Like we've covered, expanding farmland might not be possible since we have used almost every square kilometer of usable space. A significantly larger world population might require a decrease in animal protein from our diet. Either that or say goodbye to the rainforests. Then there's the erosion. Crops planted in rows are worse at holding soil than the thick carpeting that natural grasses and other vegetation has on topsoil. Rivers deposit an estimated 24 trillion kilograms of sediment into oceans every year, 2.5 times the rate before wide-scale human activity. 1/3 of all cropland, in fact, loses soil faster than it gains soil. And all of that soil deposition isn't just bad for farming, it's bad for ecosystems, it's bad for shipping and transportation, and it's bad for generating electricity. So what will the future of agriculture look like? It's hard to say, but if I had to guess, I would say the next revolution will be indoor agriculture. Growing indoors has huge benefits. You can grow all year round rather than a few months of the year. You can also control the water consumption and collect any wasted water. Fertilizers and pesticides are used in far less quantities. You can also grow almost any crop you want. No need to rely on the climate outside. This is already happening in some countries that don't really have room to spread out, so they have greatly increased their yields by growing indoors. They can also grow crops that have a much greater value per unit of weight, further maximizing their profits. Or perhaps the next revolution will be a revolution in water. We covered this before, but we don't yet have any wide-scale methods for making fresh water from the oceans. We still have so much water beneath our feet that it just isn't necessary to try to make water yet. Giant barges that produce fresh water 24/7 could exist one day. Maybe we will even turn the Sahara Desert into a savanna. We have transformed Greenland into a different kind of Greenland. Maybe we can turn dead land into thriving land. Who knows? You know what's not going to be the solution? Packing up and moving to Mars after we have terraformed it. Whatever it takes to terraform Mars, we could do that with Earth. I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about that once on Joe Rogan. Thanks, Neil. That does it for natural resources, soil, and agriculture. Next time, we are going to begin learning about how the wind, water, and ice sculpts our Earth's surfaces and creates its beautiful landscapes. Thanks for watching.